Ukrainian and Russian words, I know, because you guys decided to make a revolution, and then I did not have time anymore because I had to go to Ukraine so often and to go into the German society because they are not convinced yet that Ukraine is really a genuine part of Europe. Unfortunately, what happened on Crimea in 1945, dividing Europe, it led to a deep gap between our countries, and us in the West, a little arrogant, with a stuck-up nose, had the feeling we make our fine little nice European Union, and that is Europe. And it will take a long way that the European West understands that Europe does not end at the Oder or in the middle European countries, but that Europe is much bigger, and it means Belarus, it means Ukraine, of course. So 4 years ago, when you decided to fight down authoritarian and corrupt regime on Maidan, you could see European politicians, Western European politicians, flying in and out, being very hopeful, and we had the feeling a dream is coming true. A people is uprising against the dictator. They will send him away, and once he left with all his money and his gold, now you will be the most spectacular, democratic, free, wonderful country in the world. We were underestimating how many obstacles there are building up institutions, that the old elites would not just say, thank you, we are happy and delighted to hand over our wealth and our power to you, so that we have a nice democratic Rada now. And even the president seems to be a little undecided on which side he wants to stand. I won't say any more about that topic, it's too touchy. So, what we had to learn is that Ukraine needs much more time. And if we do not have a realistic understanding how much it takes, how long it takes for a country that has had the communist regime, which went deep into the thinking of society, and then many years of weak institutions, no rule of law, corruption, oligarch system building up, that it would be a long struggle to come to a level of a real democratic state with a rule of law, with freedom of speech, no activists being attacked anymore, and the right for the individual that he or she can live like they want to live. I agree totally with Mr. Mössinger. There is only one sentence where I would contradict you. When we say, we are going to help you. This was what we could do 4 years ago, because at that time it still seemed that we in the West, and especially in Germany, had a democratic system that was so grounded and so stable that we could just step down from our stairs, visit you, help you. And now, 4 years later, we are in a totally different situation. We are sitting in the same boat. We have to help each other. You know that it is not only Marie Le Pen anymore who is flying to Moscow constantly as a right-wing party and an ally of Kremlin and Putin, who, wherever they can, try to destroy the European Union from the inside. They are not doing it by war in our countries. They are doing it by supporting nationalistic tensions, ethnic tensions, national feelings which say we are not going to hand over any decisions to Brussels, and which pick up the idea, our country first. So during the first 2 years, I would say, with the war in Ukraine, we started to learn, and we were very naive about it, we started to learn about subversion via disinformation. And we were upset to learn how willing big parts of our society are to accept this subversion, and the outcome was they don't believe anything anymore. Even our free press seems to create fake news. So this was the first step of undermining our democracy. And now you look into Western Europe, even Germany has a right-wing party with 20%. And what happens now is that this right-wing party plus our left-wing party both travel to Crimea and show that they want to stick to Kremlin's politics because they do not want the transatlantic alliance. And the biggest blow, of course, was to learn that even the United States, which always were unbelievably important for Europe, even in the United States, we have the same virus. Even people who have the possibility to have a free voting, they themselves elect somebody who does not believe in the values of liberal, modern societies. And this really is a nightmare, having from Kremlin to Washington, all through Europe, a movement that is believing in authoritarian solutions for the countries, national authoritarian solutions, with homogeneous populations in their country. This is why we set up this little institute, Center for Liberal Modernity. We did not say liberal democracy. Yevhen told me, please explain why liberalism is not enough. I think it is very simple. Modern societies, modernism in economy, does not necessarily mean that it has to go along with liberal democratic societies. We've seen it in the history. Stalin was a modernization system. Even Hitler had many parts of a modernization system. China nowadays is the best example for a very modern economic politics and totally authoritarian. And this, we think, is the challenge which not you have, which we have. And this is what we are going to talk about today, and I'm delighted to bring back a picture to Germany, not from this perspective, but from this perspective, telling my friends, take down your nose. It's no reason to be arrogant in the West. in wonderful Germany, look that not only in Kiev, but in cities like Kharkiv, like Dnipro, like Mariupol, like Odessa, you have full rooms, much bigger than we have in Germany when 3 or 4 people are coming when we offer assemblies, who are interested in this topic and who are willing and decided to go this long way with patience and with decidedness for Ukraine to become a country with rule of law, democracy, and what we call Western values. In 1990, Fukuyama wrote his famous book about the end of history. Now, 30 years later, we are talking about the possible end of the West. So we really are at a very difficult historical stage now, and this is something we have to talk and think about together and hopefully overcome it. Thank you, and I'm now looking forward to this morning.
Thank you, Marie. But please keep the microphone, будь ласка. І ще все-таки передаю мікрофон пані Марії, тому що хочу почати.
Keep the microphone for a while because I would like to start by asking you a question. We're talking about a crisis of the liberal democracy, and first of all, we mean. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Okay, yes, so I will ask you English.
Yeah. So when we are talking about the crisis of liberal democracy we in the West, we are mostly talking about the coming to power of populist and very often far-right political forces all over the European Union. In many countries of the EU, these forces are part of governing coalitions, or they are ruling the country unilaterally as the one political force. What, in your opinion, are the reasons why people vote for these political forces, and what impact, what are the risks and implications for Ukraine?
Unfortunately, Western politics has only started to really think what are the reasons that we lose the people. For a long time, we thought, especially in Germany, democracy is going to prevail, it's stable, no challenge. I think you can even talk about a year when it started being visible that Western politics does not have enough tools, not enough democratic tools, to keep up with the unbelievable change in economy, especially the finance market. And the blow of the banking system in 2008, which showed that the banks internationally are moving in an unbelievable fastness, while we in politics did not even have an idea how to control it. That started to give this first big thinking. Politics is not working well enough to control economy. Politics is not able to protect us. And this went along with a very fast globalization, which means not everybody is gaining. We know that of course, for example, this unbelievable level of standard of living in Germany even for those people who have to be supported by the states. Not everybody is gaining on globalization. And we have parts of the country where people see that if they are not well skilled, if they are not at the top of those runners, they might be left behind. This brings about a deep anti-capitalistic feeling, and I want to remind you that the right-wing German NSDAP, the fascists, they were anti-capitalistic also. So we can even link to a deep feeling of anti-capitalism, which does not have to be answered with communism, which was authoritarian also, but which can be answered with right-wing parties, populist parties. So I think one of the main answers is stress due to globalization, the fear that people are losing security. We see that in our own country, which is with one half a transformation country, or has been a transformation country also, which was the former DDR. The difference is there was a lot of money coming from the West, the institution building was very fast, and still many people have the feeling we did not gain, we lost. If you go into the countryside, where 500 people had been working on big state farms, and now it is 4 working with big machines on that ground, you have 496 who ask themselves, where is our place? So, what we have to do in our countries, not morally say, you are not allowed to vote left-wing, you are not allowed to vote right-wing. This does not help it. People are not impressed. They want to know, can you give us perspective and security in those times which are changing so rapidly? And for this, we don't have enough answer. What does it mean for Ukraine? It means that a country like Germany is getting more and more tendencies that since democracy can't give the answer is coming from authoritarian parties and authoritarian offers, thinking. And then they look at Russia and they say, well, look at that. Putin is not so bad. At least he's not as crazy as Mr. Trump is. And then they say, why shall we disturb our stable and good relations with Russia just because of Ukraine? And look at that mess in Ukraine. Isn't Poroshenko any different from Yanukovych? And we do have some propaganda that is helping with that thinking, and a lot of money in that. And for example, many of the Russian immigrants to Germany, 3 million, of course, looking Russia Today and Sputnik. So the willingness to go into a contradiction to the Kremlin system is getting less and less. It never has been very strong. Angela Merkel, I would say, never has represented the mainstream thinking of Germany, not to talk about the parties and the fractions in parliament. So in a time where Ukraine needs this patient support, the tendency to back up from Germany and Europe as a whole is getting stronger and stronger. And you know about the development in Italy, where we don't know whether they will go along with sanctions, for example. You know Orban, you know even Austria, the foreign minister inviting Mr. Putin to her wedding. All those are signs that Ukraine is not seen as part of our fate, but that it is being seen as a disturbing factor between Germany and Russia. And this is very dangerous.
Дякую, пані Марі. Ви згадали про Угорщину Віктора Орбана, і, власне, Віктор Орбан, прем'єр-міністр цієї країни, він...
So you mentioned Hungary, and the prime minister is known to be, say, non-liberal, not just in Hungary. Some other countries of Eastern Europe have also demonstrated certain tendencies of strengthening the extreme right, the ultra-right parties. So this tendency, this shift from the liberal to non-liberal democracy declared by Orban, is it dangerous for Ukraine? And if yes, to what extent and why? That part of Eastern Europe who just got rid of the communist regime is stepping back from the democratic values. Well, good afternoon. I'm pleased to be here today, and let me start with some definitions, because we've been talking today about the liberal democracy, authoritarian regime, totalitarian regime, and each of us has our own understanding, and this is normal. I have my vision too, and it is based on certain things that I have learned during my long life. First is that the world is in the state of system balance. There is certain equilibrium, and it moves from left to right. And we are on this part of this trajectory that is associated with a movement to the right. And this is why we're talking about the crisis of the liberal democracy. And if you ask me, I would give it a slightly different name, because liberal democracy is something that humanity has arrived at, the civilized part of humanity. As Churchill once said, back in the times when no one knew of the liberal democracy, he said that democracy might not be the best thing, but we haven't found anything better yet. So the humanity hasn't invented anything better. It could be, it could shift or lean to the left or to the right equally. And there is this common factor that impacts everyone. 50 years ago, people started talking about the future shock, the fear of the future. So this avalanche is creating, the avalanche of the unknown of what's going to happen is created certain stress in everybody. And people are trying to take a step back to escape this powerful flow, and this is what's happening all over, including Africa and Asia. And if we're talking about the, say, European and Eurasian civilizations, the Eurasian is the right conservative. If we look at the Arabic world and the Russian society, at their religions that are like the litmus paper that there is the Orthodox and the Islamic religion. Because the religions that are trying to be modern, they are trying to adjust. All of them are found in the other part of the world. And the reforms started in Germany back in the 16th century, if my memory serves me right. So if we're talking about the crisis, it's not just the liberal democracy that it affects. We're talking about a certain state of absurdity. And the liberal democracy that we're dealing with today in the Western civilization, there is no tools to date to overcome the challenges and deal with the phenomena. So the negative aspects, they keep accumulating because the liberal democracy has been in place for a while. And so they accumulate, and this creates irritation among certain people who are also trying to step back, who are leaning towards the right conservative part of the spectrum. So the issue of refugees and the liberal democracy, they do not really. The liberal democracy is polycultural, it is tolerant, but then it turns out that you cannot really be tolerant to your enemy. It's absurd. You can be tolerant to other cultures. You can see them as equals unless they represent a threat to your identity, because when they do, you have to. And then you have to be tolerant. I see a line of absurdity here that can be crossed, can be easily crossed, and this is what causes irritation and not the basic tenets of the liberal democracy itself. For the past decade, the liberal democracy has been going through a set of challenges. The high taxes distributed by the state, by the government, among the certain groups of population. This creates a certain social tension. And so this liberal model of pinpointing the groups to receive the assistance from the state, this is what we're observing in the United States. The democracy doesn't necessarily have to suffer. If you want to paint Trump a monster, I think this is a mistake. I don't like him either. I'm not a fan of him, but there's the system of checks and balances that will prevent anyone who becomes the president of the United States to neglect the values of the society because they have hundreds of years of experience. When in the UK the conservatives came to power, do you see this as a threat to democracy? Of course not, because when there is 800 years of democratic experience behind your back, this is no threat to democracy to have the right conservatives in power. Regarding being politically correct, as I said, there is this line of absurdity or normalcy that cannot be crossed. This gender equality has also been, the concept has also been taken to its absurd, because men are scared sometimes to even look at the woman, and this is absurd. The same goes to the same is true for being tolerant to other cultures, for example, and then the aggressive stance of Russia. The liberal democracy of Europe has nothing to trump, that could trump this position of Russia, the aggression, because you cannot really compromise with the subversives, with the bandits. The language of aggression is the only language that they speak. You can either be at peace or at war with them. I have to interrupt you. You will have a chance to speak more a little bit later. And now my question is for Yevgen Bystritsky. to continue what Mr. Zisels has started to talk about the Russian aggression and the situation of war and its impact and influence on the liberal democracy in Ukraine. Because next year the elections are going to take place in Ukraine. So what are the chances of the democratic forces? What is your prediction as to how this standoff will end?
I would like to greet my friends and colleagues whom I have known for several years, and I greet all the audience. I want to thank Marieluise Beck, who used her energy to create such meetings in different cities in Ukraine. We really are talking about a complex issue. I would like to point out that liberal democracy was coined by Fareed Zakaria. He said that these are democracies with voter rights, but in some spheres these rights are limited, and therefore there are tensions between ethnic groups and other groups. Liberal democracy is 20 years old, speaking of terminology, but this issue is acute now because now it's manifested on a global scale from the United States to Hungary, and now it has reached us. To answer your question, I need to recall some things. A couple of years ago, Marieluise Beck organized a conference at the Bundestag with Timothy Snyder speaking. It was a very important topic. We were speaking about Russian aggression, and we were speaking about the responsibility, historic responsibility of the West before Ukraine. Not Russia, but Ukraine. You know that oftentimes Western intellectuals view Ukraine as part of the Russian or post-Soviet sphere. So Timothy Snyder was speaking about how the Nazis saw Ukraine at the center of their military attack. This is a very important shift in changing how the West views Ukraine, and it's very important for Ukraine to begin seeing itself in a different light. We have been talking about Ukraine's responsibility now for European values. So the problem is this. Inside Ukraine, we often think that we are at the frontier of the struggle for European liberal values. Indeed, there is Russia over there with an obviously unliberal, authoritarian state, and here we are in Ukraine, a country which has proclaimed itself willing to establish European values. We called ourselves Euromaidan. I would say to political scientists who are sitting in the audience, when you quote foreign authors who speak about liberal democracy, think about Ukraine that from the beginning was a national project, and we are going through a crisis of the modern liberal democracy. Most of all, I am concerned with these controversy of modern liberalism. Indeed, the principles on the level of political slogans, political propaganda. They keep talking about being oriented to liberal values. Any party can say that. We can talk about a large coalition that it supports human rights. Even we can talk about Tymoshenko, who supports human rights. We can look at the opposition bloc. They will also say that they are for human rights, which they interpret as if you have Russian-leaning population, you need to give them their rights. So I would ask you to not speak in political terms, but speak about civil society. But you will say our civil society is politicized. Civil society holds non-political values, which then, on the level of politicians, become politicized. Then we can talk about conservatism, liberalism, and so on. But what I'm concerned about in the civil society is to determine clearly different orientations, worldviews, and values of the civil society. Maidan was uniform. It was for European values, for Ukraine, against Russia. But now, the civil society, at least in the form of the organized civil society, has fractured into parts. I will try to explain which parts. So let's talk about the right sector and the volunteers who went to the front. The right sector has the right values. People who protect the authorities from any criticism. People who say, don't touch the authorities now, let's wait. Let's re-elect the same people who are in power, and then we will criticize them, because now in the conditions of war and difficult economic situation, you are undermining the unity of the country. Other people criticize actively the corruption which exists, lack of economic reform, although we have some positive reforms. I am myself from the International Renaissance Fund, and I participated in the launch of these reforms. So these 3 or 4 poles in the civil society, they show us the deficiency that we have, the deficiency of modern liberalism on the political level. What is lacking is citizens' culture. When we have debates, we still need to value the common things that we enjoy, and we need to be able to connect liberal values and those traditional and national values that Farid Zakaria was speaking about, which come in contradiction with the process of globalization and universalists' values, which feed liberal democracy as a principle. So this is what I would like to point out at this stage, and hope we can go into more detail. Thank you. Since we are talking about civil society, I would like to hear from Anna Kolokhina. She is a representative of a non-government organization, Dnipro Center of Social Studies. Speaking of liberal values in the regions, in Dnipro, what can we say about people's support? Thank you. I have a very important mission to represent civil society at this forum. I would like to continue with the general thought that Mr. Bystritsky has voiced. The civil society and its most active part is now in the process of active discussions. If we are speaking about the very difficult election year next year, so there are disputes about the way that Ukraine is going to take in the future, what reforms are happening, what must be done in the next 5 years. There is a discussion about the roadmap of reforms that was presented. At the national level, there will be discussions of this roadmap of reforms on the regional level. Coming back to our general topic, you have said a lot about the crisis of liberal democracy. I would like to talk more about the way of Ukraine. Our organization focuses on social studies. We look at the processes happening in society. We had a study that allows us to see changes in dynamics. We did a survey on world values. Personally, I'm very optimistic about the way of Ukraine. My optimism is based on the results of our study. We do this survey every 2 years. It's a global survey. And since 1980, we have been taking part in this worldwide survey, so we can prove with math the tendencies. The global community is moving towards democratization. Scientific and technical progress, fast economic progress, well-being encourages liberalization and democratization. In our country, however difficult the situation may be economically, but democratic values prevail in our country. They are more important than survival values, which is different from Russia, because in Russia the values of self-survival are dominant. The events of 2014, the war in the East, the difficult economic situation have not changed the opinions of Ukrainians. We strive for European values. Researchers who did this study for many years, they did not bank on Ukraine. They thought it was impossible, but we did it. You were speaking about Fukuyama and his book, The End of History. Frankly speaking, I am somewhat skeptical about globalization theories. If you look at any geopolitical doctrine and the distribution of countries in the world, you can look where Ukraine is on these rankings. You could say that we shouldn't be, but we exist, we are. Against all odds, Ukraine exists. Another thesis I would like to suggest, this is primarily for our German colleagues. Every time international organizations visit Ukraine or write reports about Ukraine, we always see Ukraine being compared to somebody else. It's popular to compare Ukraine with Serbia and the Serbian experience. I'd like to say that you shouldn't do that because we are unique. I think that the main defect of European organizations, let us put it politically correctly, they underestimate our unique nature. I will speak from the civil society. We do not study ourselves enough. Quite often we try to use ready-made recipes on how to improve our life. But our experience shows that those things that we borrow from others don't work well on our soil. So my hope is that in the civil society we will be looking for solutions, for ways to do it ourselves. I do hope that the civil sector will have enough stamina to convey this attitude to our politicians. Question to Mr. Yuri Reichel, a journalist. A question about informational safety. Is it really possible to defend oneself against fake news and propaganda without limiting the freedom of speech? If you put the question this way, I would say that anything is possible. You need to choose your vector and move accordingly. How can we counter fake news? In Europe, in the European Union, they haven't found a solution. We can say that they have a crisis in this respect. The American system is built on the premise that you shouldn't react to fake news. President Trump keeps writing about fake news. He writes on his Facebook all the time, but New York Times and CNN keep saying the same things. I will say that during the Crimean War, when the Great Britain was fighting Russia, the Times newspaper with the largest circulation had an anti-government position. So the Queen Victoria used to say that the Times was filled with fake news, although they did not use that term. So what? Nobody thought in Great Britain to limit what the Times newspaper wrote for two reasons: freedom of speech, and the Times is a private newspaper, and the state has no right to interfere into somebody else's property, informationally speaking. As for modernity, the problems are the following. We can see a contradiction between absolute freedom of speech and the situation in Ukraine when we have to defend our independence with arms in our hands. And figuratively, we have to do similar things in the information field to protect ourselves from pressure from Russia, and not only from Russia. You can just read what the Chinese newspaper Xinhua in their English and Russian edition rights. These are different sorts of news. So I believe there are certain problems. So we shouldn't bring the principle of the freedom of speech shouldn't be taken to the absurdity level. At war, à la guerre comme à la guerre, as the Frenchmen say. During World War II, Great Britain had military censorship. One couldn't mention, a war correspondent, for example, couldn't mention specific location where he was writing from, but the comments were free. The German propaganda was very strong also against Great Britain.
In Berlin, the radio would broadcast to the UK with very massive propaganda, and it was so massive that their news anchor was later tried by the British Marshall Court. I'm not talking about his sentence now. That's a whole different story. But then back to the contradiction. It is there, and we need to find the golden mean so that we would be able to not to restrict the freedom of speech that we have, at least compared with Russia or with Western neighbors such as Hungary or Poland, because Polish newspapers, they do have their freedom of speech, like Rzeczpospolita paper, but there are other papers as well. Same is true for Hungary. So we do have a problem in this respect, and this is not so much about information anymore, because when we're talking about the crisis of the liberal democracy in the West due to the refugees movement or some other Eastern European issues, in Ukraine, we do not have enough of the liberal democracy because we're still lacking some reforms at the level of the liberal democracy, economically, legally, institutionally, and they would all impact the freedom of speech. They would have to do with the freedom of speech, because the freedom of speech is the fundamental concept of the media. I once interviewed this man from the biggest Canadian newspaper, and he said that economic survival is the top priority for our paper. We were discussing the electronic newspapers or the paper versions, and he said that my friend from Washington Post is dreaming about completely going online. They still haven't, but that's what he said. And their circulation is growing in the West. And once again, they're growing. So finally, Western Europe might be facing some problems with the migrants, but look at the Latin America, look at Argentina, or the recent events in Brazil, or Chile, or Colombia. They are all leaning to the right. But this is not an alternative to Germany. This is central right, because the left centrists, they have brought the Latin America to this cliff, to the edge of the cliff, and now the task is to help the countries step back and prosper. And the same goes for Ukraine or for Brazil, that is pierced with corruption, from the impeached president to the lowest level of government. despite the economic growth, when the 30 million people were issued were issued credit cards, and it was a huge thing for the country back then. So we're not in the same kind of crisis of the liberal democracy as the West, because our top priority is to build the liberal democracy in Ukraine in its classical understanding, without corruption, with solid state power, and with the corresponding legal and other institutions, and the freedom of speech, of course. That's me as a professional. We still have an hour to go, but we should save most of it for the Q&A, so we still have a couple of questions to our speakers. So, Ms. Maria, about the upcoming elections in the European Parliament, what implications would those elections have for Ukraine, and is there still any chance for the European liberals to stop this wave of populism?
I think if you're realistic, we have to put up with the future that the European Parliament will have much bigger fractions coming either from the extreme right or from the extreme left. And I don't know how it is over here in Germany. For a long time, the left in general had the feeling that it was always morally and ethnically on the better side. They did not see that a left can be totally authoritarian. Was Stalinism, was that a right-wing movement, or was it a left-wing movement? It was called itself ideologically a left-wing movement, the communist movement. And it said we are allowed to use even dictatorial measures to bring the people to their happiness. So this did Hitler with his right-wing ideology. So I don't know whether our translation was good enough, Josef. Then I would contradict you. Then I would say what we have to learn is that right-wing extremists and left-wing extremists are very close to each other in their understanding of being nationalistic, not defending the right of the individual, but of society, and mainly a homogeneous society. So they are anti-Semitic, usually. They are Islamophobic, if it's in the Western European countries, or they have national fights even within their country, like Belgium. So we are going to see in the upcoming elections of the European Union that the belief in our Western values is becoming less and less strong. And so the question is going to be, what does that mean what does this need as political answers? And I said it has a lot to do with globalization, fear of people, social cohesion. Migration is, people feel it is a threat for them, like we had anti-Semitic movements even in cities where we don't have one single Jew. But migration brings about stress to societies. It brings about good impulses, but it also does bring about stress. And in Germany, when Angela Merkel said, we are going to make it, from the human side, it was wonderful and liberal, but now, a few years later, we see that not all facilities in this society were prepared for 1.5 million Muslim, Arabic, Syrian people. So this is in the end is we need institutions that bring about security even with the rule of law. Rule of law means security. If somebody takes away your enterprise and you don't have a court where you can go and you can be sure that the judge will come out with a sentence according to the law, but because into how much money he got from somebody else. This creates the feeling of insecurity. So it is about, liberalism also is about security.
Дуже дякую. Пане Йосифе, я знаю, що ви хотіли ще прокоментувати.
You also wanted to comment, Mr. Zisels, how should Ukraine react to these anti-liberal tendencies in other countries? I would like to say a lot. Unfortunately, we have little time. First of all, I would like to add about that model. You know, I was talking about the pendulum moving. It's a natural phenomenon. It doesn't matter what politicians think, whether they want to go right or left, it's beside their will. There is a movement to the right. We can only understand what the negative aspects are. We can try to minimize them, but it's impossible to fight it just like a natural disaster, like an eruption of the volcano. So this move to the right is connected to the crisis of the liberal democracy, but not the democracy itself, but some of the negative aspects that have accumulated, the extremes in democratic tradition. Populism is not against liberal democracy. We can say that the left can be populists. I think Julia Tymoshenko is a left populist. Her latest initiative to freeze gas prices is left populism. There are right populists. But to fight them, we don't have to leave the platform of liberal democracy. We cannot talk about Ukraine in terms of liberal democracy. We haven't built it yet. We are only on the way to building it. If Ukrainians want to live in a liberal democracy, and this is what the Maidan showed, it doesn't mean that it has been realized. I joke that we have lived for 300 years in the empires. Let's live for 300 years in a Western civilization, and then we will compare which is better. This is my joke, but before the time it's impossible to compare this. We are just at the beginning of our way. It's an evolutionary way. No revolution will give you a result that evolution can give. Revolution can give you goals. This is what the revolution of dignity showed us. We need to move towards Western civilization, and we must go there. Now, about the civil society. Our moderator said that we are unique here. This is the first time in history when a large and populous Orthodox country is being torn away from the empire, when Belarus, the Baltic states were torn away from the Russian Empire. It was different. Belarus is smaller and the Baltic states are Catholic. So, for us, it's different. Thinking in the categories of identity, in 20 years it would be great, God be thanked, if we could be a big Bulgaria, a Russian Orthodox, Ukrainian Orthodox, country with post-colonial experience. Bulgaria, Romania, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Southern Europe. These are countries with a high level of corruption. Does corruption prevent economic growth? It impedes economic growth, but in those countries it's part of their culture, of their identity. In Protestant countries, in Germany for example, from childhood, from birth, children are taught it's profitable to be honest. This is what is being taught in the northern countries. But in eastern countries, what is taught to children, it pays to be dishonest. It is the only way to stay afloat. Let's direct our efforts toward education. This will be guarantee that there will be less corruption in the future when our children grow. Now, the shift to the right conservatism in Poland, in Hungary, 19 out of 28 European countries have right-wing governments or coalition with participation of right-wing parties. Right-centrists are very influential. Radicals are populists. You are right, but the main component of this right shift is due to right centrists. I may be mistaken, but nobody can overcome these challenges, including the Russian aggression, except the right centrists Europe, if Europe is united. The closest analogy to modern current times is 1980s, 1990s, when the Soviet Union subdued all Eastern Europe. I remember 1970s very well. Helsinki Treaty was a way by which the Soviet Union wanted to deceive the West. They were talking about human rights, but it was all deceit. I was arrested in 1978. I was a member of the Helsinki group activists, and when we were arrested, that was an indicator that the Soviet Union was lying and the West, as a result, was reformatted in a more conservative way. The Reagan administration was leading this movement, and liberal governments in the West, they joined this move. So please do not scare us with the right centrism. It will be very helpful to withstand the aggression of Russia. I see no other way out. Very interesting thought. So, we can agree that there is still no liberal democracy in Ukraine. We are just building it. It's a difficult process. Mr. Bystritsky, trust is very important for democracy. How can Ukrainian democratic forces unite? How can they find trust, which is so often lacking? I don't like these arguments like a tail on a cow grows downwards and that's how it will always be. You know, when we talk about democracy, this is a set of ideal images. In political studies in the West, there is a very interesting concept, epistemological unfaithfulness. When we have ideals, the Maidan had a set of values or feelings connected to Europe. no corruption, freedom of speech, the authorities must be in dialogue with the civil society, and so on. These are ideal images, epistemological images. But in reality, things go the way they have always been. So I would say we are in a liberal democracy, because Ukraine is a national democracy of liberal character, which is oriented to European values. But it's different how we carry out these ideals in practice. I agree that this is a process. I don't want, and I don't agree with people who say that we need to go around the desert with Moses for 40 years. I don't have so much time. I don't want to wait for 40 years. Since last year, people like me who can call themselves political scientists or activists, we had a meeting of such people, and we were deliberating about the upcoming elections. When we see ratings of trust, the surveys, quite a sad picture. 14% of support for Tymoshenko. It's a very suspicious picture, and it's a crisis. The problem is that the forces that are in authority and forces that are in opposition, neither of these groups do not satisfy us. They do not provide liberal democracy values. They do not show us that they are open and sincere, that they have no conflict of interests. What they offer in terms of separating business from politics, how can we demonopolize and remove oligarchs from power? How can we make our country more just? This is what Sviatoslav Vakarchuk talks about. These issues are not being solved. So when we had this meeting of activists, political scientists, there are about 25 people in this group. You know them because they're often on television. We ask ourselves this question: so what shall we do during the election campaign? The campaign has started, and you can see on TV people talk about community bills, gas tariffs. So we said we should ask our citizens to think about the agenda of the elections. It's a very simple idea. We would like candidates to answer very specific questions which relate to the mandate of the president. Not everything in the world. We also had this idea: if we take all democratic forces, there are 5, 6 democratic movements, well-known democratic movements, including Samopomich and other parties, Democratic Alliance, the Power of People, the Wave, Gritsenko Party. So what if we suggest to these parties to unite, hold primaries, and nominate one candidate, not to be against Poroshenko, Zelensky, Tymoshenko, but since you already exist and you are so fractured, how do we achieve real competition when we can discuss real issues on the agenda? So we had that talk, and we haven't moved further because it's really difficult to bring together and unite these democratic movements. So how to overcome distrust? It's an organic process. We will see. I think in February, closer to the election date, things will be changing. Two quick questions to Marie and Yuri. There are some people who say, in conditions of instability, we need a strong leader. What do you think about that? I'll say right away, let it be. They can say it. We have pluralism of thoughts. Let them think this way. But it's another issue whether the society will support this proposition. Yes, I'm talking about the survey results. It is also our unique mentality trait that we are very freedom-loving. Ukrainians are so freedom-loving that they will not go for this authoritarian model of rule. You can see what happened to Yanukovych. This can be a forecast for the next strong leader. Okay, I have a question. Was Churchill a strong leader? Adenauer, de Gaulle, were they strong leaders? A strong leader in a democratic state is quite possible, but Great Britain and Germany after World War II, Adenauer played a huge role in building the Federal Republic of Germany on democratic foundations. What about strong leaders in Japan? There is a great democracy in Japan. What about Nehru in India? India is also a democratic state. It is possible to have a strong leader in a democratic state, but it doesn't mean that this leader has to be a dictator. Dictatorship is a problem. Even if in short term, dictatorship can bring some results. Pinochet in Chile, Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore. Still, there must be a transition to democratic foundations. A strong leader must function within a democracy, but the strong hand does not have to be dictatorship and authoritarian rule. We will not talk about Russia, which seemingly has a strong leader, but let's talk about China. A strong leader with a country in a difficult economic situation. We are used to viewing these giants like Shanghai, but there is a larger picture about what China is. We keep talking about myths relating to China, but things are not so good over there. So let's not jump to the right or to the left extreme. A strong leader is possible, but there has to be democracy. And now we have time for questions from the floor. Please introduce yourself and specify which of the speakers you want to answer. Hello, Веревкина Lilia, non-government organization. I have a question for international organization. Maybe it's a rhetoric question. Why is there discontent from the population towards democracy? Because when democratic countries send humanitarian aid, you give our authorities the right to distribute that aid. If I'm not mistaken, 75 million is given by Europe as a help to IDPs, and there are already meetings taking place that this should be directed specifically to the needy people. So perhaps the international community needs to have stricter control of how their aid is distributed. I understand. Thank you.
Who's ready to answer?
You might see me getting totally upset, because I can tell you I have switched from the life of a parliamentarian to the life of an NGO initiative. And what we are filling out of forms, bureaucracy, in Germany, in Ukraine, you wouldn't believe it. It almost kills us. I think with humanitarian aid, you always have a problem. It is not enough for all the people. And then most of them have the feeling it all disappeared somebody else. The real main fact for this country is that as long almost 5 billion euro disappear due to custom criminality, almost 5 billion. 75 million humanitarian aid are nothing compared to that. Even if we talk about Nord Stream, and your politicians come to Germany and say, do not build Nord Stream, I agree we shouldn't, due to political reasons, but they say because Ukraine will miss 2 billion euro. This is bad. But if 5 billion are disappearing at the borders for custom reasons, and I see all those SUV driving through your cities, knowing that your average income is 200, I always ask myself, who is driving such a car? I cannot afford a car like that in Germany, and I have been parliamentarian for 34 years. So this is what it is about.
Пан Йосиф також хотів додати.
Yosef, you wanted to add something?
Це також питання. Це єдине?
Yes, I also wanted to ask a question. Is this the only thing that you aren't happy about and the rest is fine? I tried to explain that in the East, in the Eastern society, where corruption is part of the identity, part of the local culture, and when children are being brought up using the principles of being dishonest and in the lack of trust. So what Western man could think, could come up with a scheme that would be 100% effective in a country like this one? No one. So whoever is in charge of the distribution, it is going to be the same, more or less the same. It is about the upbringing of children, teaching them that being dishonest is what you can benefit from. And like Yevhen said, that he doesn't want to wait 40 years to walk that desert like Moses. Our Ukrainian people, that's what we have been doing. In the 90s, it was communists. Then in the millennium, in our government there were ex-Komsomol members. So in Bulgaria, they put a lot of effort into fighting the drug circulation. And they couldn't do anything about it. But as soon as they hired Belgians to work at the customs, the situation improved 92%. By 92%. Mr. Mössinger wanted to add something.
Yes. And I sign almost every day a contract with an organization. I haven't counted how much money of German taxpayer I have signed away in this sense. And I've never, ever signed any contract with any government agency, only with NGOs. So I contradict strongly to that opinion that we give money to the government and not to the NGOs. It's the opposite. We only give it to the NGOs and we don't give it to the government. Sorry, I'm working for 3.5 years on that now. And I do not accept to tell me the opposite of what I'm really doing. So that is the first thing. I do not contradict to the fact that there is a lot of corruption, and there is especially a lot of corruption in the customs services, but not only there. But we have started, or we have done since the beginning of the crisis. Is it humanitarian aid? We give it to the people directly and we distribute it through our agencies. If it's NGO work, we give it to the NGOs directly. If it's human rights support, we give it to the human rights organizations, and so on and so on. I have never, ever signed any contract with any government agency since I'm here.
Дуже дякую. Давайте наступне питання. Попрошу все-таки казати, до кого ваше питання, щоб ми могли почути більше.
Make sure to specify who should answer your question. My name is Stanislav Zazula, and what I was missing today was the numbers, because the economical part, because the liberalism initially, the classical liberalism was about the free markets. So if we're talking about the right or left, extreme movements, even though they're all left to me, talking about Stalinism, they were left because they restricted the right to own property and so on. And as to Mr. Zisels said, I agree that conservative movement does not necessarily have to scare you. What was your question? My question is, do you agree that Thatcherism was, first of all, about the economy and then about the other things, and it did not limit personal freedoms? And what we need to go back to the free economy, because it was a question for Mr. Josef, right? But Ms. Maria also wanted to answer.
I never said that conservative parties or thinking is contradictory to democracy. Never would say that. Taking the question of liberalism and market economy, if you look at Russia and at the 90s, you have had an experience where very convicted liberal politicians opened the market in a very quick way, and the problem was it turned out to be a catastrophe, because there were no rules yet, there were no institutions yet. The way the oligarchs could somehow assemble within few years an unbelievable amount of money and wealth is one of the reasons that Putin managed to have such a stable power now, because whatever he does, he says, look at my authoritarian way of running the country. Everybody is safe now, and look back into the 90s, where in this chaos, there were times where you didn't even have enough food to eat. This is the problem. So this country, Ukraine, it needs to turn to market economy, of course, but at the same time, you need institutions to have borders for capitalism. Capitalism needs borders. borders, not only because of the people and justice questions, but also, I say that as a Green parliamentarian, because of ecology. Look, when you talk about the Donbass, go to Mariupol. I just looked to pictures from Mariupol. If people cannot breathe anymore and children get sick, it is the best example that economy needs political shaping. That is what it is all about.
Я дякую, що знайшлася в залі людина, як і я, не боїться права.
It's great that we have someone who is not scared of the right conservative like myself. So going back to the market mechanisms like back in the Thatcher times, what we discussed we spoke with Yevhen today, we're not just talking politically, we're talking this general shift, in particular concerning the human rights and the economy and the politics. So to go back, somewhere we need to have been there in the first place. We have never had any market economy, so there is nothing to go back to. The only thing we could go back to is the former Soviet principles of distribution that we used to have. We still have a lot of enterprises that are government-owned, and they are the central posts of corruption. So we need to develop the liberal mechanisms, economic mechanisms in particular. Talk about the land, for example. A lot of it is owned by the people who are not too eager to have it officially transferred into private ownership because they own it already. There are certain myths about Thatcher and her conservative shift. We have to realize that that shift occurred after the laborists were in charge of the UK, and they were from the left wing, and they were left-centered, and the Great Britain suffered from it. So what Thatcher did was just creating a free market as it is. So it was about going from the nationalized market to a free market. So the Great Britain in the times of Thatcher just returned to Europe, and that's it. So we should not overrate her contribution.
My question is to Marieluise. We are considered to be very aggressive ecological organization, and often we hear skeptical attitude. People treat us like a radical movement, as if they say that people have nothing to eat, but you are concerned about ecology, you arrest people, you protect the trees. So, in the current situation, political and economic, in Ukraine, do we need to change our radical approach to defending ecological issues, or should we shift into more democratic discussional form of our work?
I think initiatives always have to know that in the end, in democracies, you have to find compromises. Ecological necessities do not allow to think about a dictatorship for the good of ecological questions. If you look at the Bible of ecologists, the Club of Rome in the 1970s, which was written by Nobel Prize winners, they were willing to have authoritarian, even totalitarian ways of governing because they said it is necessary for the ecology. This, I think, cannot be accepted. What we need is ecological voices that speak out very clearly what is happening, and at the same time they need to fight for support in the society. In Germany, I am Green, belong to the Green Party. We started fighting against atomic energy plants in 1979, 1980, and it was 1998, 20 years later, where we finally had a government and parliamentarian decision to close down the atomic plants one by one and shift over to renewables. And if you start giving out of your hand democratic procedures and you claim it for the good of ecology, somebody else might claim it for the good of their religion. Others might be claiming it. I think we always have to stick to democratic rules. That includes that you have the possibility to campaign, for example. That includes all those democratic rights we have. Freedom of speech, freedom of demonstration. We need a press where you have a chance that objective information, and there are facts. It's not everything is only opinion. There is facts, that facts come to the population, but not step out of democratic procedures. I'm very convinced about that.
Дякую. Ще час є на 2 питання, тому прошу оперативно.
We have time for 2 more questions. Ex-deputy of the City Council of Dnipro, participant of the Orange Revolution of 2004. There were 4 of us who started an organization, Our Ukraine. 2 of them are present here, and the other 2 are in power now. We were fighting for our country, but I will tell you this, I'm tired. And as you said, I don't want to wander around the desert for 40 years. I agree that the right-center feelings should be, because 20 years ago we had 5 billion people in the world. Now we have 7, and the earth is able to feed 12 billion people. We are fighting for food now. So there has to be a leader. There have to be right centrists. But these leaders must be strong, like General de Gaulle. I want to tell you about our country as it is here below. Please, a question. My question is to Marieluise. I want to tell you that here, when they study parties and determine that these are nationalists, these are centrists, and they label these parties. But people are out there in the parties only for money. To overcome that, we need to start at the bottom level, at the grassroots level. When I was campaigning and going door to door, voters were telling me, "You are a good guy, we will vote for you." On the election day, they vote for those people who give them some cash. So we need support from Europe. Germany succeeded in raising up from the bottom in 1945. You managed to do that because of education. So my question is, how can you educate us? In my childhood, we were taught that people in Africa are hungry. They are starving. We were fed those stories. But now we would like you to educate us, to teach us how to live honestly. How can you help us in this way?
I have to disappoint you. I'm not going to come here and say we are going to educate you. I tell you, being German, I know that we have been coming here in 1941 and it was not very pleasant for this country. I remember that. And we are not going to step into this country telling you that we have to educate the Ukrainian people. It's something different, talking about how modern education looks like, what it looks like, exchanging different ways of teaching, talking about what is important in schools, for example. By the way, I have been working for 30 years now with many team members coming from Russia, Ukraine. I do not see that they have not been educated to being honest. What I see, Josef, is that they are very timid. They are timid. They are afraid to make decisions themselves. They come and ask all the time because they have been used to that you have to ask an authority before you decide. This is a very important way how education has to change. In our schools, children work in groups, for example. They find solutions in teams. They are not afraid of teachers, but teachers try to be in a good, if it works well. Not all our schools are working that well. But the tendency is they take their teacher as somebody who is accompanying them in their way of growing up, using all those unbelievable possibilities which the new technologies bring about for the next generation. So this is, again, I would say, the difference between Eastern education and Western education is authoritarian in the East versus liberal thinking in teams, having self-confidence, being brave, being courageous, even making mistakes is not so bad, because if you can then change the decision, everything is fine. This is what I think is necessary in your schools. Students not sitting like this anymore and the teacher standing in front, but students sitting in groups and the teacher going between the tables, looking how they are working. This is, I think, what is the basis for vivid democracies, because you need a population that is really self-confident. One more sentence about this earth and how many people this earth can feed. In around 1900, Malthus, you might have learned his name in biology, he stated that this earth has only the possibility to feed 1 billion people, because of the acres being limited. Now we have 7. People are eating more and more meat, which needs much more acres than eating grain or fruit, vegetables. The Chinese are stepping in, eating meat. They are already in Ukraine because they have discovered how many acres there are in this country, and still there would not have to be any hunger in this world. We will have inventions that we will be able to feed 12 billion people. Human mankind has the possibility to make intelligent answers to the problems of our times. This is one of the wonderful parts of us as a species. We can at the same time make huge mistakes, like Chernobyl has been showing in this country. But that does not say all evolutionary inventions or new ideas should be stopped. The other way around. Go ahead, find intelligent solutions for ecology, for reducing the energy we are using. There will be many, many modern possibilities, and this earth has enough room to feed and make a good life, actually for everybody who is living on it. The question is, do we find the strength, the political will to do that, not spending our wealth and our inventions on leading a war like you have in the East now, but really going ahead to use our capacities to make life, yes, good for almost everybody or everybody on this earth.
Дякую, Марії, за таке розголошення.
Thank you, Mary, for such an extensive answer. So one more question. Lyubov Chernova, sociologist from non-government organization Open College. It's an association of scientists and teachers from the universities. We are concerned with new technologies and new ways of education. In November, we will have a discussion about community and the new society. I wrote to the Cologne Institute a work about multi-party system in the post-Soviet states and transformation of Ukraine society. I listened to Kasters in Moscow in 1989. He was reading his forecast, and I believe that prognosis was fulfilled because he was predicting globalization and changes in information society. I think that the crisis of liberal democracy is due to wrong forecasts, people not accounting for novelties. Can you specify your question, please? Perhaps humanity is transitioning into a new civilizational platform, a new political system and economic system which must use all the best things that have been achieved, but on a new basis.
І тоді іще вже останнє питання, прошу, дівчата, мікрофон.
The last question, please. University of Oles Gonchar, postgraduate student of political studies. Question to Mr. Bystritsky. We talked about not negotiating with the bandits, but Russia is forcing on us the scenario of an unrecognized republic like Transnistria.
Process of the non-visa regime, despite of the attempts of the pro-Russian lobby in the European Parliament. What is the opinion of between the deputies of the Bundestag and the ordinary German people to the non-visa regime between the US and the European Union and the Ukraine? Thank you.
Дякую. Євгене.
So what bandits are you talking about? Can you clarify? Russia is pressing us to hold direct negotiations with these so-called republics. If Russia recognizes their elections, we will have to recognize their elections. In no way must we agree to legitimize those authorities which are not independent, they are only holding to their power because of the Russian bayonets. It's not acceptable. Speaking about European history, the relationship between morals and politics, morals and honesty. In Europe, not morality was first. First, there was a very strict system of punishment and justice. You can read about that in the works of Foucault. When people say we don't have enough morals, and that is why I think I'm also answering Josef here, that this is our culture, our identity. Historically speaking, there are two lessons to be learned. We must do our best to reform the justice system so that maximum access to justice is given to all citizens. We must fight corruption in the courts. And then the so-called conventional ethics, which should be present, of course, and it should be from the childhood, this ethics will help us fight corruption. So, not ethics is primary, but law, or they are simultaneous. You can read Freud and Michel Foucault about this. And then the voice of the conscience will be internalized, and the person will say, oh no, I shouldn't do that, this is not right. So at least these two processes will be parallel. Moralizing and talking about not doing bad things from the childhood, but an effective system of law that would fight corruption. Also, an answer to the previous question about international aid. There was a certain Yelena Trigub who worked in the Ministry of Economics. She had a project to coordinate donor support because it was uncoordinated and used ineffectively. Our task was to find a different way. There needed to be coordination between international donors, but speaking about using donor funds, local communities need to be involved, engaged in the distribution of international aid. So the very, very last small question. Fyodor Grishchev, just a couple of words. Let me thank you, honorable members of the discussion. My name is Fyodor Grishchev. I have a suggestion and a request. We heard a lot of interesting information. We will process it, maybe critically. Such discussions need some practical output. So I have a request towards Vladislav Romanov, Anna Kalokhina. We have a representative of our state regional administration. Maybe we can hold one or more in any format event to discuss what we didn't have time to discuss today. We can reflect on what was discussed here, so we can discuss and find a compromise, if not a consensus. And speaking about Dnipro region and the city of Dnipro, I think it is necessary to take some practical steps, because we were talking about the way of Ukraine. We may not have a vision for the whole of Ukraine, but if we speak about our region, what shall we do to go through this crisis and achieve a certain civil progress? So I'm asking you, please find a certain format for one or several events to meet and discuss further the issues that were raised today. Indeed, this is a very, very good suggestion. Mr. Zisels, you would like to add something? There were a few questions about our party structure. What shall I say? There are no real ideological parties, neither left parties like Labour Party, nor we have the Conservatives. We have what is common in the Eurasian sphere. There is a leader, and then a party is formed around the personality of the leader. And that is why there is a problem of disunity. Every person in power has a circle of support. They distribute money among their friends, and they do not cooperate with others. So speaking about the way of Ukraine, Ukraine is shifting towards conservative and right politics. To me, it's not a problem. But the problem is that the right conservatives and the left movement have excesses. This is what we should discuss. We cannot influence this shift towards the right, but we need to minimize the excesses, because neither Poland nor Hungary, who are on this right conservative way, they were not able to avoid defects and the negative excesses of moving in the right direction. What negative aspects am I talking about? Radical activity of the ultra-right subgroups when they act outside the law, when they perform some extreme actions. This is what we should be concerned about, and the structures in the civil society and in the law enforcement agencies, there need to be some responses to such illegal activities. Secondly, in Poland, this shift towards the right conservatism is also connected to the Catholic Church, and the Church in Poland has a very long tradition. They played a large role in the solidarity movement, and they are doing it today. This should be taken into account. We are in the process of the Orthodox churches uniting. For me, it's a very positive phenomenon. But because we live in a paternalistic Eurasian society, we need to understand that all churches have equal rights. They are all divided. They are split. There are 3 or 4 Orthodox churches. There are many Protestant groups. And because of that, we have a balance of power, but after this unification process is completed in the Orthodox Church, it may become an authoritarian force. This also should be our concern. We need to preserve this chaotic democracy in the religious sphere. We don't need the church a unified church to have a unified influence on the state. Let them all influence the government, but equally. This will be our response to the right shift. The very last question, and after that we will draw a conclusion.
Will you let me speak then? Okay. You both can ask your questions. I'm a professor of philosophy, and my question is about the crisis of liberalism. I think this might have to do with the fact that liberalism has deviated from the main values of humanity, the universal values, hence the crisis. So we need to look into those reasons. That's just my remark. And thank you for it. I think Yevhen has something to say. Liberal democracy is based on a set of values. Those are the ideals that all of the European countries are trying to attain. When we signed the Lisbon Agreement, those ideals were at its core. Of course, there are different identities in Europe, and the European countries are pursuing the values in different ways, but those liberal values, values of democracy, they are based on the universal concepts, and there's this Christian civilization and the old ancient Greek aesthetics and the Roman law. This is what the European liberal values are based on. I think that some of the speakers disagree. Just to add, I fully agree. I just wanted to add that the process that gave rise to this conservative wave is well known to everybody. It has a simple name, and I'm a philosopher talking to a philosopher. The simple name is globalization. We're talking global markets, global communication, when those universal values meet. The universal human rights, especially in terms of the national identity, expressed in what we usually call traditional ethics or conventional ethics of different communities, of different national communities and ethnic communities. So it's a simple example. The universal human right is to choose the gender. This is my right as a human. And then this right meets the right to choose the way of life, to choose the freedom of conscience, and it comes into contradiction with the conventional ethics that the extreme rightists are preaching, that you're ruining families by choosing your gender. So this dissemination of the standards and norms, and then the clash with the culture, with the traditions, and there are ways to address it, and we have mentioned some of them today. My name is Vlada, and I'm also a postgraduate student of the politology department. And my question is to Yuri. When we talked about the information politics and the fake news, you said that, if I understood you correctly, that the best strategy when we're talking about fake news is to ignore them, as Trump is supposed to do, while his Twitter is full of all those tweets. So when we're talking about Ukraine, it wasn't in 2014 or even 2013 that the fake news started coming here. It was way before that. And somehow we're always trying to catch up. While it would be much more practical and effective to try to predict it and prevent it. We need to draw a clear line, identify the two main components. Fake news could be different. It could be a subversion in the information space, what our eastern neighbor is doing. And that fake news needs to be addressed in an appropriate manner. And we always should be a step ahead. This is what the people in power should do, what our government should do, and what they're failing to do effectively. This is the first element, and the other is just the fake news that could be ignored and should be ignored. Because this other category, this fake news, is just the white noise. If you turn on the radio, you will hear it, this buzz. No words, nothing said, just the buzz, the white noise that has to buzz out all the important information. And here we're talking about the very, very serious things. We're talking about the restriction of the freedom of speech, and there is no good way to address it, really. Like in the United States, there's the First Amendment, and there's no way for them currently to restrict the freedom of speech of Russia today, because that would be a violation of the First Amendment. And Russia today is just an avalanche of fake news. And they tried to do it in the UK, for example, to limit that somehow, but there is no legal way to do that. Or in Germany, when Russia won, broadcast a fake news about some girl who was raped, but it turned out she just ran away from home, and a suit was filed. But the German court said, well, that was the opinion of the reporter. That was his take, and that was it. So there is a certain crisis of the liberal democracy in this sense as well, in this narrow space, in the media space, and there's no universal solution. Every country should act in their own way, given their own context. And it's true that we need to try to be a step ahead. We cannot reach the non-governmental territories of Ukraine and the Crimea through the television, that's true. And it is a big issue, a different issue, and we will address it later on. But today, those non-governmental areas, they are covered by the Russian media, and they are influenced by it. In France, in 1918, they faced the same challenge, where a part of their territory was confident that they were Germans, and that was Eastern Belgium in 1945. And this is what we will have to deal with when we will deal with the reintegration of Donbass. But this is the election year, so I'm guessing this is not the top priority today. Now, Mr. Messing will say a few words, and then we will wrap up.
A newsletter that appears every week, and that is put together in Russian language as well by the European Commission in Brussels, which is called Anti-Fake Newsletter. And there they put together the current anti-fake headlines from media outlets, not only from Russia, but also from other European countries who more or less follow Russian narratives. And they do it in a way that you smile, that at the end you can see how ridiculous some of these fake news are. And now they have a very good record already, archive, so they discover that some of the fake news more or less regularly come back in these media outlets. So they said something about laws in Denmark which are allow all kinds of sodomy suddenly, yeah? Of course, completely ridiculous, but to show that the West is going downhill. And then half a year later, the same news comes back again, and then they can say, oh, that was already 6 months ago. And this kind of, I think this kind of anti-fake newsletter is the only way which is actually helpful and which is absolutely completely legal. Nobody can be against that. So if you want, everybody can hook onto the EU Commission's website, download this newsletter every week, and it will be it will look less dangerous to you if you read this, because it shows you how ridiculous all these fake news are. The only problem is not many people know about this anti-fake newsletter. That's why I'm telling you, so that another 100 people know about it and can then share it to others, to your friends and colleagues and university and so on and so on. Because that's the only way to fight fake news, to know the real news, and to show to everybody who believes in these fake news that they are fake news. So that's my recommendation.
Дякую, пане Вольфганге. Отже, я перепрошую, що
рекомендація для вас. I'm sorry we don't have. I'm afraid we don't have more time for all of the questions, so we need to wrap up because we really have no time. So just in summary, just 3 minutes. Wrap up our today's discussion, and the floor is given to Vladislav Romanov, a politologist, a political analyst, and head of the Dniprovsk International Relations Foundation. Since we were talking about reflections today, I have a lot of them. The first concept is that all of us here are criticizing the political system, and the 350 or something political parties, they deserve it, no matter how many of them are using democracy as a word in their name. And then there is this arithmetic democracy, when there's 226 votes that determine the winner and the loser, and we've been swinging on this swing for 20 years. Remember Kuchma, and then there was Maidan, and then there was authoritarian regime, and then democracy. And we're about to enter the new election stage, and the analogy does not seem that good. There can be no arithmetic democracy in a fully capable civil society. We need to find consensus. If we look at the sectors, the different segments, the political segment is the one where we see the most resistance. They either merge or overtake each other, and we have to do something, maybe some short-term campaigns, and that would be enough to be an example, although politicians are not very eager to follow it. So we need to move from the mathematics to the consensus, to working out an agreement, and we do need the education for that. We do need the time. We do need the political culture. The second concept that I wanted to talk about is that we really do need to take the economy into account. I agree, as has been said today, and we will keep on reflecting on the topic of crisis of the liberal democracy and otherwise. And there is this handful of intellectuals who are thinking about it, who are reflecting in it, who are writing books. But it's the issue itself is bigger than that. We need to strengthen the foundation through the normal things, through creating an effective institution of owners, because a poor person, when they have to decide between the constitution and the food or cash, that's what they would choose, the food or the cash, and they will sell the constitution and they will sell their future. And as we can see today, there's this resistance when we're talking about development of small and medium businesses, about the land reform, the medical reform is not going that easy. And this has to change. And another front line, and it's actually a good thing because we've been talking about the constitution and the choice that the people make. The good thing is that people really want the change to happen, and we will have the 3 elections to go, and it will not be easy, but when we're talking about the agenda, we have to tell the government what to do. We have to decide and to tell them what to do. And we should think not so much about the food on our table, but we should think about the vector that we should take, so that all of the issues mentioned by our honorary guests are relatable to us, and because Europe is a common space and we will be sharing it and living in it together. Thank you.